When did your golden retriever friend finally snap? My friend Macy was 13 when she started sacrificing her own life to save her little sisters. Zada had aplastic anemia, meaning she needed extra blood, bone marrow, even organs. By 16, Macy had donated over 500 pints of blood, had corkscrews drilled into her for bone marrow 6 times, even gave Zada a kidney and 60% of her liver. At 18, she was down to 87 pounds, taking 23 pills a day to keep her remaining organs functioning. Her dream of motherhood was dead, her immune system was destroyed, and her bones fractured upon the slightest impact. But Zada was alive, thriving and living the teenage life Macy gave up. 2 years later, Macy got diagnosed with lymphoma. Doctors said it was likely the extreme stress she put her body through. And yet, Macy didn't cry or didn't complain. All she asked for was one thing. When cancer patients finish their last treatment, they ring this brass bell in the main lobby. 3 rings to say you survived. Macy had watched dozens of people ring it. Their families would cry and cheer. She wanted that. For once, she wanted to be the one being celebrated for surviving. She texted the family group chat. June 15th, they let me ring the remission bell. Would mean the world if you could be there. Zada instantly responded with heart emojis. The whole family promised they'd be there. The morning of June 15th, Macy did her makeup for the first time in 2 years, and even styled what was left of her hair. During her final treatment, nurses kept asking how she was feeling. Amazing! My family's coming, she kept saying. They're all coming to see me ring the bell. At 2:45, Macy was sitting in the lobby watching the main entrance, her hands shaking from excitement. But at 3 p.m., there was nobody there. The bell coordinator asked if she was ready. Just 1 more minute, Macy said. They're probably just parking. At 3:05, Macy texted the group. Hey, I'm at the bell, waiting for you. Zada read it but gave no response. Macy called her and got nothing. She called mom and got the same, but her dad answered. Hey, sweetie, what's up? Zada was laughing in the background. Dad, I'm at the hospital. The bell ceremony? There was a pause. Oh crap, honey, that's today? We threw Zada a college acceptance party. She got into Berkeley. Full ride. Macy's legs gave out. She sat down hard on the lobby bench. Zada's party? Her voice was tiny. Yeah, it was a surprise thing. She wanted to celebrate getting into pre-med. You know, following in your footsteps. Helping people like you helped her. Then Zada shouted into the phone. Is that Macy? Tell her we'll celebrate with her later. Dad, Macy whispered. I'm at my last cancer treatment. The bell ceremony. I texted everyone. You all said you'd come. Oh, honey, you know how bad I am with texts. Look, ring the bell and have someone video it. We'll watch it later. He hung up. The lobby was now full of other patients and families, all watching this girl in a yellow dress sitting alone. Macy stood up slowly and walked to the bell. She was supposed to ring it 3 times, but she rang it once. A few people clapped awkwardly, and that's when the tears started coming. Pamela, the head nurse who'd been with Macy every step of the way, ran over and pulled her into a hug. I gave her everything. I gave her my body, Macy cried. I can't have kids because of it. I gave her everything and she couldn't give me 10 minutes. The next Sunday was their regular family dinner. Macy almost didn't go, but habit is hard to break. She walked in and everyone was still talking about Zada's Berkeley acceptance. Nobody mentioned the bell. Nobody asked about her final treatment. Nobody even said congratulations. Halfway through dinner, Mom casually said, Oh, Macy, did you do your little bell thing? Macy set down her fork. My little bell thing? Yeah, at the hospital. Dad said you called during Zada's party about the bell? You mean the bell that means I beat cancer? The bell you didn't see me ring? Macy shrieked out. That's when Zada piped up like it was funny. Oh my God, Macy. You're so dramatic about everything. It's just a bell. It's not like ringing it changes anything. You still beat cancer either way. The room went quiet, and Macy looked around the table. At her parents who were already back to eating. At Zada who was suddenly on her phone replying to a text. You know what? Macy said. Her voice steady and cold. You're right, Zada. It is just a bell. Just like how you getting into Berkeley is just an acceptance letter. Just a piece of paper. Doesn't change anything, right? Zada rolled her eyes. God, why do you always have to make everything about you? We get it. You donated stuff. You had cancer. But the rest of us have lives too. I donated stuff? Macy stood up. I donated stuff? How about I donate your acceptance letter to the fireplace? She started marching to the framed acceptance letter. Dad's chair scraped against the floor as he jumped up and his hand wrapped around my wrist before I could reach the frame. Mom was already on her feet screaming about how I was ruining everything again and being selfish like always. The acceptance letter sat there behind glass while Dad's grip got tighter and my thin wrist started hurting under his fingers. Zada didn't even look up from her phone and kept scrolling through Instagram like we weren't even there. I yanked my arm back hard and Dad let go but stayed between me and the fireplace with his hands up like I was some wild animal. My voice cracked as I started listing everything I gave up for her while tears ran down my face. The blood draws every 2 weeks that left me dizzy and weak for days afterward. The bone marrow extractions where they drilled into my hip bones while I bit down on a towel. The kidney surgery at 14 that took 6 weeks to recover from and made me miss the whole school year. The liver donation that nearly killed me when I got an infection and spent 3 months in the hospital. My destroyed immune system that meant I couldn't go to the school dances or football games or even the mall. The 23 pills I take every morning just to keep my remaining organs working right. The fact that I'll never have kids because my body is too damaged from all the donations. Zada finally looked up and rolled her eyes like I was being dramatic about nothing important. Mom kept yelling about how ungrateful I was, and Dad stood there shaking his head like I was the problem. I pushed past him and headed for the front door while Mom followed me screaming about family loyalty. The door slammed behind me, and I ran to my car parked on the street in front of their house. My hands shook so bad I dropped the keys twice before getting the door open and falling into the driver's seat. I sat there for an hour with my whole body shaking while tears soaked through my shirt and snot ran down my face. My phone buzzed and Pamela's name showed up asking how family dinner went since she knew it was Sunday. I typed back that I finally stood up for myself and hit send before I could change my mind. The phone rang immediately, and Pamela's voice was soft and worried when I answered with a sob instead of hello. She told me to come to her house right away and not to go back home no matter what. I started the car and drove the 15 minutes to Pamela's small house near the hospital while she stayed on the phone. She was already standing on her porch when I pulled up and ran to my car before I could even turn it off. Her arms wrapped around me as I fell apart completely, and she helped me inside to her living room. She made me chamomile tea while I sat on her couch wrapped in a blanket that smelled like lavender fabric softener. I told her everything between sobs about how they forgot my bell ceremony for Zada's party instead. How they couldn't give me 10 minutes after everything I gave up to keep Zada alive and healthy. Pamela sat next to me and rubbed my back while I cried about feeling invisible in my own family. She didn't try to defend them or tell me I was overreacting like everyone else always did. Instead, she just listened and handed me tissues and made sure I drank the tea she made. When I finally stopped crying around midnight, she set up the couch with sheets and pillows from her closet. I fell asleep still wearing my clothes from dinner and woke up to sunlight coming through her living room window. My phone showed 17 missed calls from Mom and a bunch of texts calling me selfish and dramatic and ungrateful. Dad's texts were different and asked me to come home so we could talk about this like adults. I deleted them all without responding and found Pamela in the kitchen making scrambled eggs and toast for breakfast. She took one look at my face and told me I didn't have to go back if I wasn't ready. We ate breakfast in silence, and then she reminded me about my follow-up appointment at the hospital that afternoon. I'd forgotten completely with everything that happened, but Pamela said she'd drive me there herself to make sure I went. We got to the hospital at 2, and my oncologist took one look at me and asked what was wrong immediately. I weighed 85 pounds, which was 2 pounds less than last week, and my eyes were red and puffy from crying. Pamela quietly told him about the bell ceremony while I stared at the floor and picked at my fingernails. The doctor sat down and looked at me with real concern instead of just checking boxes on his clipboard. He said the stress wasn't good for my recovery and asked if I had anyone to talk to about everything. Pamela mentioned she knew someone, and the doctor wrote down a name on his prescription pad and handed it to me. Jonas Hodges specialized in family trauma and medical PTSD and had an opening that same afternoon at 4. Pamela drove me there even though I said I could go alone because she wanted to make sure I actually went inside. The office was in a small building near the community center and had plants everywhere and soft music playing. Jonas was younger than I expected with kind eyes, and he listened to my whole story without interrupting once. When I finished, he asked me what I wanted from my family, and I just stared at him confused. I realized I'd never thought about what I wanted because it was always about what they needed from me. After the session, Pamela drove me back to her house and we found Zada sitting on the porch steps looking annoyed. She said Mom and Dad sent her to bring me home and she'd had to cancel plans with her friends because of me. I told her I wasn't coming home until things changed, and she stood up with her arms crossed looking mad. She said I was being petty about a stupid bell and making everything about me like I always did. When I reminded her about the kidney and liver and bone marrow, she just shrugged and said, that was my choice. Nobody forced me to do any of it, and I couldn't blame them for living their lives now. Pamela stood in the doorway watching us, and I could see her jaw tighten at Zada's words. Zada grabbed her car keys and shook her head like I was being ridiculous. Whatever, Macy. When you're done with your pity party, maybe you'll remember we're your family. She stomped down the steps and got in her car, slamming the door so hard the whole car shook. Pamela put her hand on my shoulder as we watched Zada speed off down the street. She really doesn't get it, I said, my voice breaking. Pamela guided me back inside and made more tea while I sat at her kitchen table staring at nothing. She was only 5 when it all started, Pamela said quietly. To her, it was just normal that you gave her what she needed. I nodded, but it didn't make it hurt less. 3 days went by with me sleeping on Pamela's couch and helping her with small tasks around the house to feel useful. On the 3rd morning, I heard a car pull up and looked out to see Dad's truck in the driveway. He got out alone and walked up to the door looking tired and older than I remembered. Pamela answered, and I heard him ask if I was there and if we could talk. I came to the door and he immediately started apologizing, saying he screwed up and wanted to take me to lunch to make things right. Pamela gave me a look that said I didn't have to go, but I grabbed my jacket anyway. Dad drove us to the diner we used to go to when I was little before everything changed. We sat in a booth by the window and he ordered coffee while I got water because my stomach couldn't handle much else. Macy, we love you, he started. We just got caught up in Zada's excitement about Berkeley. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the family group chat from 2 weeks ago. Look, Dad, I said, turning the screen toward him. There were all the messages about my bell ceremony with everyone promising to be there. Mom sending heart emojis, Dad saying he wouldn't miss it for the world. He stared at the screen for a long time, then pushed the phone back to me. When are you coming home? He asked, changing the subject completely. I need space, Dad, I told him. I need to figure out who I am without being the family donor. He paid for my untouched water and drove me back to Pamela's in silence. That afternoon, Pamela helped me look at apartment listings online, and we found a small studio near the hospital that accepted disability payments. The next day, we went to see it, And even though it was tiny with peeling paint and old appliances, it had a window that got morning sun. I signed the lease right there using my disability check for the deposit. Pamela took time off work to help me move while my family was gone during the day. We packed my few clothes and the medical supplies I needed into boxes and drove them over in 2 trips. I didn't have much since most of my life had been spent in hospitals or recovering at home. Pamela helped me set up the bed she'd bought from a thrift store and stocked the tiny kitchen with easy foods I could digest. That evening, my phone started ringing nonstop. Mom had come home to find my room empty and was losing her mind. Her voicemails got more and more angry, calling me selfish and saying I was tearing the family apart. In one message, she even said she was calling the police to report me missing, but I heard Dad in the background reminding her I was 20 years old and could live wherever I wanted. I turned my phone off and sat on my new bed in my empty apartment feeling both free and terrified. The next week, Jonas helped me write a letter to my family during our session. We spent the whole hour getting the words right, explaining my boundaries and what I needed from them going forward. The main thing was family therapy if they wanted any relationship with me at all. Jonas mailed it for me because I couldn't trust myself not to throw it away instead. A few days later, I saw a flyer at the community center for a cancer survivor support group led by someone named Freya Mansfield. I went to the next meeting and sat in the back listening to people share their stories. When Freya asked if anyone new wanted to introduce themselves, I raised my hand and told them about the bell ceremony. Several people nodded like they understood, and one woman started crying. After the meeting, Freya came over and said she was glad I came and hoped I'd keep coming back. For the first time, I felt like people actually understood what I'd been through. I started going every week and slowly began sharing more of my story. 2 weeks into living alone, I woke up on my bathroom floor not remembering how I got there. My phone was ringing somewhere, but I couldn't reach it. Everything hurt, and my vision kept going dark. I managed to crawl to where my phone had fallen behind the toilet, but my hands were shaking too bad to unlock it. It kept ringing and ringing until finally it stopped. Then I heard pounding on my door and Pamela's voice calling my name. She used the spare key I'd given her and found me curled up on the bathroom floor barely conscious. She called 911 and held my hand while we waited for the ambulance. At the hospital, they put in an IV and the ER doctor, a young guy named Dorian Blake, actually sat down and listened while Pamela explained my whole medical history. He ordered a bunch of tests and admitted me for observation, saying my body was shutting down from malnutrition and dehydration. He connected me with a nutritionist who specialized in patients with complicated digestive issues from multiple organ donations. The next morning, I woke up to voices in my room and saw Freya standing there with 3 people from the support group holding a bunch of get well cards and flowers. They'd heard I was in the hospital and came to check on me even though we'd only known each other a few weeks. One woman brought homemade soup she said helped her during chemo, and another guy brought a stack of books he thought I'd like. They stayed for an hour just talking and making me laugh about random stuff, and I kept thinking how these people I barely knew were doing more for me than my own family had done in years. Around noon, I heard Mom's voice in the hallway arguing with someone, and then she burst through the door with Dad right behind her demanding to know why I hadn't called them. I pressed the nurse call button and asked them to leave because I needed rest and low stress like the doctor ordered. Mom started yelling about being my mother and having rights, but Dorian showed up and told them visiting hours were for supportive visitors only, and that my medical team had concerns about stress affecting my recovery. When they wouldn't leave, security came and walked them out while Mom kept shouting about how ungrateful I was. That night, I checked my phone and saw Zada had posted on Instagram about how I was being dramatic and wouldn't let the family visit me in the hospital, even though they were worried sick. The comments were mostly her friends agreeing until someone who went to high school with us commented asking if this was the same sister who gave her a kidney and part of her liver. More people started commenting about remembering me being sick all through school from the donations, and suddenly Zada's post had dozens of comments calling her out for being selfish. She deleted it, but screenshots were already spreading, and Pamela showed me one where someone had written a whole paragraph about watching me pass out in chemistry class the day after a bone marrow donation. 3 days later, Dorian signed my discharge papers with a thick folder of instructions, including a strict nutrition plan and appointments for twice-weekly check-ins with the medical team. Pamela had taken time off work to drive me home and help me get settled with all the new medications and special foods I needed for my damaged digestive system. She stayed the whole first day making sure I ate every 2 hours like the nutritionist ordered and helping me organize all the pills I had to take at different times. The next week during my session, Jonas suggested I start writing in a journal about what my life might look like without my family's expectations weighing on me. I spent hours that night filling pages with dreams I'd forgotten I had, like traveling to places I'd only seen in the hospital TV, maybe taking online classes since I never finished high school. Because of all the medical stuff and having friends who saw me as a whole person instead of spare parts for Zada, I wrote about wanting to learn guitar and go to concerts and eat at restaurants without worrying if Zada might need another organ someday. 2 days later, Dad sent me an email with the subject line, "Let's fix this," saying they would try family therapy, but only if I came home first to show I was serious about working things out. I wrote back that therapy had to come first, because living at home wasn't safe for my mental health right now, and Jonas had already said I needed stability for my recovery. Dad replied saying I was being stubborn, and Mom was crying every day, but I didn't answer because I had an appointment with the hospital social worker who was helping me apply for additional assistance programs. She pulled up my medical records to fill out the applications, and her face went white when she saw the list of everything I'd donated and how young I was when it started. She kept asking if my parents had pressured me, and I explained about Zada being sick, and how it just became expected that I'd give whatever she needed. The social worker made copies of everything, and said she'd never seen someone give so much of their body before age 18, and that there might be programs specifically for young donors, though she'd have to research it. At the next support group meeting, Freya asked if I'd be willing to share my story with everyone since she thought it might help others understand family dynamics around illness. I was shaking when I stood up but started talking about growing up as the healthy sister and how that meant I was supposed to give whatever Zada needed to stay alive. When I got to the part about the bell ceremony and my family choosing Zada's party instead, several people started crying, and one woman got up and hugged me. After the meeting, an older woman came over and introduced herself as Carol, and said her family had done something similar when her brother had cancer, and she was expected to be the strong one who never needed anything. She gave me her number and said to call anytime I needed to talk to someone who understood what it was like to be invisible in your own family. The next day, Mom finally agreed to one family therapy session, but insisted on bringing her own therapist, who she'd been seeing for years. Jonas agreed to a joint session, but warned me on the phone that this might be more about her trying to control the narrative than actually making progress, and to prepare myself for that possibility. The session was scheduled for Thursday at 2, and I got there early to talk with Jonas first, but Mom and her therapist were already in the waiting room going over notes together. Mom's therapist was this older woman with gray hair pulled back tight, and she kept nodding while Mom pointed at papers she'd brought, probably lists of all my supposed problems. Jonas came out and his face tightened when he saw them huddled together, but he stayed professional and was invited everyone into his office. The room felt smaller with 5 people, and Mom immediately took the chair closest to her therapist, while Dad sat on the couch looking uncomfortable. Mom's therapist started talking before Jonas could even introduce himself properly, going on about how Mom had been traumatized by Zada's illness, and how some children don't understand the stress parents go through. She kept using phrases like attention-seeking behavior and inability to see the bigger picture while looking right at me. Jonas tried to redirect by pulling out actual medical documentation about my donations and the physical toll they took, but Mom's therapist waved it off, saying, "Physical sacrifice doesn't mean emotional manipulation isn't happening." Mom was nodding along and adding comments about how I'd always been dramatic even as a kid, and how I was jealous of Zeta getting into Berkeley. I started shaking, and Jonas noticed, asking if we could focus on the missed bell ceremony since that was the current issue. But Mom's therapist said that was just one incident being blown out of proportion. She actually used the word performative to describe my cancer treatment celebration request. That's when Jonas stood up and very calmly but firmly said we needed to stick to documented facts, not interpretations, and he started listing every single donation I'd made with dates and medical impacts. Mom's therapist tried to interrupt, but Jonas kept going, explaining how a 13-year-old can't legally consent to that level of medical donation, and asking why my parents never got me psychological support during those years. Mom's face got red and she stood up, saying she didn't come here to be attacked, and that Jonas was clearly biased because I'd poisoned him against the family. Her therapist stood up too, saying this wasn't a productive environment, and they should continue Mom's healing journey elsewhere. They walked out together, leaving me shaking on the couch while Dad just sat there staring at his hands. Jonas gave them a minute to get to the elevator, then sat back down and asked Dad if he wanted to continue. Dad nodded slowly and moved to the chair Mom had left empty. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded check, his hands trembling a little as he smoothed it out on his knee. He said he'd been thinking about everything since our lunch, and he'd calculated what my medical bills must be and wanted to help. The check was for $30,000. I stared at it because that was more money than I'd ever seen, but also because it felt weird, like he was trying to buy his way out of guilt. Jonas asked Dad what he hoped the money would accomplish, and Dad said he knew it couldn't fix the past, but maybe it could help my future. I took the check because honestly I needed it with all the bills piling up, but I told Dad money couldn't repair what was broken between us. He nodded and said he understood, but he wanted to keep trying. Maybe do individual therapy with Jonas if I was okay with that. Jonas said he could recommend someone else for Dad since treating multiple family members separately could get complicated, but Dad said he trusted Jonas after seeing how he handled Mom's therapist. We scheduled Dad for the following week, and he hugged me before leaving. A real hug, not the quick pat thing he usually did. 3 nights later, I was heating up soup when someone started pounding on my apartment door. Through the peephole, I could see Zada swaying and fumbling with her phone. When I opened the door, she practically fell inside, reeking of vodka and crying about how everyone at Berkeley orientation thought she was horrible. She kept saying people were sharing my story online and calling her selfish and ungrateful. I guided her to the couch and went to make coffee while she ranted about how unfair it was that people were judging her for something that happened when she was sick. She said she didn't ask for my organs, and it wasn't her fault Mom and Dad made me give them. The coffee maker was taking forever, and Zada kept getting louder, saying I'd ruined her fresh start at college by telling everyone our business. When I brought her the coffee, she knocked it over, reaching for her phone to show me the comments people were leaving. While I cleaned up the spill, she started crying harder, saying she wasn't a bad person, and she didn't understand why I hated her so much. I sat down next to her and said I didn't hate her, but she needed to understand what really happened. I went to my bedroom and got the folder I'd been keeping with all my medical records and the photos Pamela had taken during my treatments. Zada's face went white, looking at the pictures of me at 73 pounds with tubes everywhere and bruises covering my arms from all the IVs. She kept flipping through the pages, seeing the bone marrow extraction records and the surgery notes from the kidney donation and liver resection. Her hands were shaking as she saw the forms listing all the complications and the permanent damage. She looked at a photo from right after the liver surgery when I was swollen and yellow and could barely open my eyes. Then she found the fertility report saying I'd never be able to have children because of the trauma to my body. She threw up then, barely making it to the bathroom, and I held her hair back while she sobbed between heaves. When she finally stopped, I helped her back to the couch, and she asked why I did it all if it was going to destroy my body like that. I told her because I loved her and wanted her to live. That simple. She started crying again, but differently, saying she was scared of becoming a doctor because she'd never be as selfless as me, and everyone would compare her to what I did. She said she felt like a fraud going into medicine when she'd taken so much from someone else. I told her she didn't need to be me. She needed to be herself, but she also needed to recognize what others sacrifice and never take it for granted. She asked if she could stay, and I made up the couch for her. We talked until the sun came up about everything we'd never said before, about how scared she was during her illness and how guilty she felt now, seeing what it cost me. She admitted she'd made herself believe the donations were no big deal because accepting the truth meant accepting she'd been part of destroying my body. I told her she was a child and it wasn't her fault, but she had choices now about how to move forward. She fell asleep on the couch and I covered her with a blanket, then sat in the kitchen watching the sunrise and feeling like maybe something had finally shifted. The next week, Zada showed up at our parents' house during Sunday dinner and announced she wanted to do family therapy for real, not the joke session with Mom's therapist. Mom immediately started protesting, saying they didn't need some stranger telling them how to be a family, but Zada cut her off. She said if they didn't agree to real therapy, she would defer Berkeley for a year and tell everyone it was because her family was too dysfunctional to support her education. Mom's face went pale because Zada's Berkeley acceptance was all she'd been bragging about to her friends. Dad said he thought therapy was a good idea, and he'd already been seeing Jonas individually. Mom looked betrayed, but Zada pulled out her phone and showed Mom the Berkeley deferment form already partially filled out. Mom caved then, agreeing to one session with Jonas, though she kept muttering about not needing therapy. Jonas fit us in that Friday, and the office felt different with all four of us there, trying to actually work instead of fight. Mom started to give her usual speech about doing her best, but Jonas redirected her to talk about her feelings during Zada's illness. She finally admitted she was so terrified of losing Zada that she stopped seeing me as a separate person with my own needs. She said watching Zada almost die broke something in her, and she couldn't handle thinking about what I was going through too. Dad talked about feeling like a failure as a father because he couldn't fix Zada's illness or protect me from having to sacrifice so much. He said he pretended everything was fine because acknowledging the truth meant admitting he'd failed both his daughters. Zada surprised everyone by saying she'd used my sacrifices as a shield from survivor's guilt, that it was easier to minimize what I gave than to face the fact that she was alive because I'd given up pieces of myself. Jonas leaned forward in his chair and said something about sitting with these feelings without trying to fix them right away, and Mom started crying harder than I'd seen her cry since Zada's diagnosis all those years ago. She kept wiping her face with tissues and trying to talk, but the words wouldn't come out right, just broken pieces about being sorry and not knowing how to be a good mother to both of us. Jonas waited until she calmed down enough to speak clearly, and then Mom looked right at me and said she was sorry for missing my bell ceremony. Really sorry. Not the kind of sorry that comes with excuses. She started to add something about being overwhelmed with Zada's party, but Jonas raised his hand slightly and Mom stopped mid-sentence, took a breath, and just repeated that she was sorry. Period. Dad reached over and squeezed my hand while Zada stared at her shoes like they were the most interesting things in the world. After the session ended, I sat in my car for 20 minutes just processing everything, and then I texted Pamela about an idea that had been forming in my head. I wanted to have my own bell ceremony, a redo with the people who actually showed up for me during treatment. Pamela texted back immediately with heart emojis and said she'd help organize it, and within an hour, Freya from my support group was on board too. Dorian responded to my message saying he'd switch shifts to be there, and by that evening, 12 people from my support group had confirmed they were coming. The next morning, Mom called asking if we could have coffee, and when we met at the little place near the hospital, she asked about the redo ceremony Pamela had mentioned. I told her it was happening next week and watched her face fall when I didn't immediately invite her. She started to ask if the family could come, but I cut her off and said they needed to show me they were serious about changing first. 3 more therapy sessions with Jonas. Real ones where everyone participated, and then maybe they could earn the right to be there. Mom's jaw tightened the way it does when she thinks someone's being unfair, but she nodded and said they'd be at every session. That week we had our first follow-up with Jonas, and Dad talked about his childhood, how his own father never showed emotion, and taught him that being a provider meant working hard and not talking about feelings. Zada opened up about the pressure she felt to be perfect since I'd given up so much for her to live, how every achievement felt like it had to be big enough to justify what I'd lost. Mom struggled more, but eventually admitted she'd always seen me as the strong one, the one who could handle anything. So when I was donating, she focused all her worry on Zada, and assumed I'd be fine because I always was. Jonas helped us see how these patterns had built walls between us, and for the first time it felt like we were actually talking to each other instead of past each other. The second session was harder because Jonas had us practice active listening, where we had to repeat back what the other person said before responding. Zada got frustrated when she had to really hear me describe the physical pain of donations, the way the bone marrow needle felt like fire spreading through my skeleton, the months of weakness after giving up my kidney. She threw up in the bathroom halfway through and came back pale and shaking. The third session focused on making amends without expecting forgiveness, and each of them had to tell me specifically what they were sorry for and what they would do differently going forward. Dad promised to see me as an individual, not just in relation to Zada's needs. Mom said she'd stop minimizing my struggles and start showing up for the small moments, not just the big ones. Zada cried through her whole apology about taking my sacrifices for granted, and promised to honor what I'd given by being grateful instead of guilty. The morning of my redo ceremony, I woke up nervous but excited, and when I got to the hospital, Pamela had decorated the whole lobby with yellow ribbons, my favorite color. My family was already there, sitting quietly in the corner, and Dad was holding a bouquet of sunflowers. Mom had a gift bag that I later found out contained a photo album she'd made of my treatment journey, with notes from nurses and doctors about how brave I was. Zada was wearing a shirt that said, "My sister is my hero," that she'd had made specially. When it was time, I walked to the bell with Pamela on one side and Freya on the other, and the lobby was packed with people from my support group, nurses from my treatment team, even some patients I'd gotten to know during chemo. Jonas stood with my family, and I saw him put his hand on Mom's shoulder when she started crying again. I grabbed the rope and rang the bell once, clear and strong, then twice, then the third time so hard the sound echoed through the whole hospital. Everyone erupted in cheers and applause, and Zada was recording it all on her phone while tears streamed down her face. Pamela pulled me into a hug and whispered that she was so proud of me, and then everyone was hugging me and celebrating, and it was everything I'd wanted the first time. We moved to Pamela's house for a small party she'd organized, and my family not only came but stayed the whole time, helping serve food and actually talking to people about my journey. Mom sat with Pamela for an hour, asking detailed questions about my treatment, what the hardest days were like, how Pamela had seen me struggle, finally wanting to understand what she'd missed. Dad helped clean up without being asked, and told Dorian how grateful he was that I'd had good doctors looking out for me. During the party, Zada stood up and clinked her glass to get everyone's attention, then announced she was using part of her college fund to start a foundation for sibling donors. She'd already filed the paperwork and wanted to call it the Macy Foundation, focused on providing support and recognition for siblings who donate to family members. She'd been working on it secretly for weeks, researching what resources were needed and how to structure it, and she wanted me to be on the board to help guide the mission. I started volunteering at the hospital the next month, working with teenagers going through cancer treatment, and Dorian introduced me to the pediatric oncology team, who immediately put me to work. The kids connected with me because I'd been through it recently enough to remember the little things, like how the chemo taste stays in your mouth for days, or how frustrating it is when people say you're so strong when you just want to be normal. Dorian told me after my first week that I had a gift for making the patients feel seen and heard, not just treated, and the head of pediatric oncology asked if I'd consider working there part-time once I was stronger. My family started a new tradition of monthly dinners where we'd go around the table and each share something important from our lives, something we needed support with and something we were grateful for. The first few were awkward, but by the third month it felt natural, and Mom actually started bringing a notebook to write things down so she wouldn't forget to follow up. Dad started texting me random things during the week, just checking in or sending funny memes, trying to build a relationship that wasn't just about family dinners. Zada called me before every big test or presentation at Berkeley, not for advice but just to hear my voice, and she'd tell me about her classes and her roommate and the boy she had a crush on, normal sister stuff we'd never done before. 6 months passed and my body started recovering in ways the doctors hadn't expected. My weight climbed to 95 pounds and my cheeks actually had color again. The new medical team at the hospital adjusted my medications, and suddenly I was down from 23 pills to just 12 a day. My hands stopped shaking, and I could walk upstairs without stopping to catch my breath. Dad started showing up at my apartment every Tuesday with printouts about vocational rehabilitation programs. He'd spread them across my kitchen table and we'd go through each one while he made notes about deadlines and requirements. He found programs that let me take classes online at my own pace, and never once mentioned how Zada was doing at Berkeley or compared our education paths. One program offered medical coding certification, and Dad helped me fill out every form and even drove me to the assessment appointment. The night before Zada's first day at Berkeley, she called me at 2 a.m., crying. She thanked me for everything I'd given her and promised she'd become the kind of doctor who sees the whole family, not just the sick kid. We both cried on the phone for an hour, and she told me she'd been reading about sibling donors and finally understood what I went through. Mom started sending me articles about medical trauma in families every few days. Then she signed up for her own therapy with a specialist who worked with parents of sick children. Her emails got longer and more honest, and one day she wrote me an apology with no buts or excuses attached. She admitted she'd been so scared of losing Zada that she forgot to see what she was losing with me. Pamela called me one afternoon with news that she'd been promoted to head of nursing education. She wanted me to speak to new nurses about family dynamics and how to support the siblings who donate. I agreed immediately, and spent weeks preparing my presentation with photos and medical records. The first time I spoke to a room full of nursing students, they all took notes and asked questions about things I'd never thought anyone cared about. The hospital administration contacted me 3 months later about creating new protocols for sibling donors. They'd reviewed my case and realized there were no support systems in place for kids like me. The committee met every week, and we designed requirements for psychological evaluations and counseling for donor siblings. They wanted to call it the Macy Protocol, and I cried right there in the conference room. The program would require hospitals to provide mental health support and recognition ceremonies for sibling donors. Thanksgiving arrived, and for the first time, my family planned the entire menu around my dietary restrictions. Mom called me 2 weeks before to get a list of foods I could eat without getting sick. Zada spent hours researching recipes and testing dishes that would work with my damaged digestive system. She made 3 different kinds of stuffing until she found one with ingredients I could handle. Dad grilled plain chicken just for me while everyone else had turkey. They set up a whole section of safe foods on the counter with labels, so I knew exactly what I could eat. Nobody made comments about my special needs or acted like it was a burden. We all sat around the table with Pamela and Dorian and Freya joining us as my chosen family. Mom had invited them without me asking and set places for them like they'd always belonged there. Zada kept checking if I needed anything, and Dad actually turned off the football game so we could all talk. Pamela told stories about my strength during treatment that my parents had never heard. Dorian explained how my volunteer work was changing the way young doctors thought about patient families. Freya shared how my story had inspired other survivors in our support group to set boundaries with their own families. Mom took notes while Pamela talked and asked real questions about what I'd gone through. Dad got emotional when Dorian described finding me collapsed in my apartment and how scared he'd been. Zada held my hand under the table when Freya talked about the isolation sibling donor's face. After dinner, we played board games and nobody mentioned Berkeley or grades or achievements. We just existed together as a family where everyone mattered equally. Looking around that table at my biological family finally seeing me and my chosen family who'd always seen me, I understood something important. I wasn't just the spare parts anymore or the sick girl who survived cancer. I was valued for who I was beyond what my body could give. My stories mattered and my pain mattered and my recovery mattered. The empty space that used to ache in my chest whenever I saw other families together finally started to fill. This was what I'd wanted all along, and it only took losing everything to finally get it. Thanks for wondering through all of this with me. It's been really interesting sharing these moments together. I'll catch you next time. Subscribe for more content like this.